The first question I have is about your new bill pertaining to abortion. Can you tell us a little bit about this bill and the exception it's asking for?
Thank you for having me, Una. Yeah, so last week I filed House Bill 1301, which would provide an exception to Arkansas's current total abortion ban. This exception would apply to mothers whose babies have been diagnosed with a condition that will make it impossible for them to survive outside the womb.
So what does that mean? What type of conditions are we talking about? Is it a choice at all?
Right. So these are conditions that that I have heard about from women who have lived through them and from doctors who have diagnosed them. These are not conditions that will make the baby's life challenging. These are conditions that when diagnosed, confirm that the baby will have no chance of survival. Examples are things like anencephaly, where part of the baby's brain or skull cap doesn't form. We also hear of babies being born without having developed kidneys. These are things that are critical for life, to survive as a human outside of your mother's womb. And without them, devastatingly, these babies will die. So when babies are diagnosed with these conditions, which can happen, along the course of a pregnancy, as mothers get scans and tests, we can know that they would happen. That these can be diagnosed, halfway through a pregnancy, say at the 20-week anatomy scan. And at that point, a mother could learn that her baby has no chance of surviving outside of the womb. Yet she will have to, under current Arkansas law, carry that baby all the way to term, go through labor and delivery, possibly have surgery because often vaginal births are too risky with these kinds of conditions, and then leave the hospital without her baby, which of course was always the inevitable outcome. These situations are almost impossible to think about in terms of how heartbreaking they must be for the mothers that have to go through them. These are deeply wanted, deeply loved babies. These mothers have to grieve their losses. Under Arkansas's current law, the only option for them is to carry that baby all the way to term and give birth. This bill, the small exception to our abortion ban, would allow these mothers to grieve these losses in a way that eases their suffering as much as possible.
Now, you did say that going through a birth like that could be harmful to a mother giving birth to this baby who will not survive outside the womb. Does this fall under the current one exception that we have in Arkansas when it comes to abortion?
This bill doesn't really aim to address that life of the mother language. And you're right, under current Arkansas law, if the life of the mother is in danger, an abortion is technically allowed. Of course, we know that determining what point a mother's life is in danger is very, very difficult to do. It's not as if there is a clear, bright line. At 12:01 p.m., the mother's life was not in danger. At 12:02 p.m., it is. And so then an abortion becomes legal. Oftentimes, these things grow gradually. The risk grows and grows and grows until it reaches an emergency level. So, I think that language needs fixing too, but that is not at all what this bill aims to do. This bill, again, is narrowly tailored to those situations of life, of diagnoses of fetal anomalies that are incompatible with life outside the womb.
Now, I know that you were thinking about other exceptions when we talked earlier, right after the Dobbs decision came down on the U.S. Supreme Court. Why not push it to other exemptions, for example, incest and rape? I think we discussed that in the past before.
Session is relatively long, right? Session, it goes quickly, but we've got 3 or 4 months of this, and we're in week 4. So I would say hold tight. I am sure that there are lots of abortion bills that are headed our way. But right now, this is the bill that I am focused on. And this is the conversation that I hope we can really have in a way that is grounded in science and compassion and as far removed from kind of political heat as possible.
Okay. Now, Representative, have you talked to any constituents who have had instances and experiences, or have you heard about situations where a mother has undergone a situation like that before?
Sadly, yes. So I have spoken on social media about this issue a few times, and every time I do, I hear about personal stories. I hear personal stories from constituents and from women across the state of Arkansas, women who were told at their 20-week scan that their baby had no chance of survival. Some of the women that I've talked to have chosen to terminate those pregnancies. Some of the women that I talked to haven't. I do know that the women who have not chosen to terminate those pregnancies have told me heartbreaking stories of going to the grocery store and having strangers rub their bellies and ask them about the impending birth, ask them if their nurseries were all done, while these mothers know that there didn't need to be a nursery because there was not going to be a baby that came home with her. These mothers chose to grieve their babies by carrying them to term and then birthing them. But for some mothers, that's not the choice that they want to make, and the state should not mandate that that's the choice that they do make. If we know that these babies have no chance of survival, we owe it to the women in Arkansas to allow them the option to birth those babies as soon as they're ready. And then hopefully, if they'd like to, start to try again for their deeply wanted babies.
Okay, Representative Nicole Clowney joining us from Little Rock. Thank you so much, talking in depth about her new bill. Thanks so much for joining us.